This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. The 2022 election is still 6 months away, but primaries for the 2022 election, where each party selects its candidates, are happening now. Some Republican candidates who were endorsed by Donald Trump have gone on to lose Republican primaries, raising questions about his actual influence over the party and over its voters. Being on the campaign trail is also very different from actually governing. In recent years, sometimes candidates have run on ideas that sound good in theory, but then once they win, they find out are actually not as popular in practice or are not possible for other reasons. This episode is part one of a running series here on Politics and Media 101, where we'll examine political messaging in the 2022 US elections. A lot of important questions hang in the balance. How are the parties and how are the candidates bringing forward ideas? What ideas are they bringing forward? How are those ideas resonating? What are voters asking for? All of these things will add up to a result in November, and potentially, that result will be a change of control in the House and/or Senate. I think anyone looking at the last few years in America would agree that elections definitely do have consequences. So our goal will be to illuminate how ideas flow through that system and what it all means in real time as it's actually happening. Please take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss these episodes and also other interviews we have coming up with members of Congress, members of the media, and experts from around the world. Today's episode is a conversation between our co-founders Justin Higgins and John Gunnison. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Good afternoon, Justin. How are you?
It's evening, John, but I'm doing well.
I suppose you're right.
How was your day?
My day flew by so quickly that I thought it was the afternoon instead of the evening. But we're gathered here because I think it's actually a really good time for a discussion about the 2022 elections. And it's not because it's November yet, Justin. It's because the primary season has seen some pretty significant developments. We've had primary elections in Ohio. We've had primary elections in Pennsylvania. We've had primary elections in Georgia just this week. So it's actually, I think, a pretty good time to take stock of what's going on. Now that we're shifting from the internal party fights and towards the general election, now that we know who some of the major candidates are going to be in the fall, it's a really inappropriate time to kind of take stock of where we are as we shift into the party versus party battle. What do you think about that?
I think there's a long way to go in the primaries, but I think it is an appropriate time to get into messaging issues because of the recent issues with abortion, the fact that we had a rather large primary on Tuesday night, and the fact that the Pennsylvania primary, although in recount, looks like Dr. Oz is probably going to be the winner. So if nothing else, we can get into the messaging that the GOP and even some Democrats will use, the landscape of these elections in November, and try and give a preview of what to expect. Because a lot of people are hearing a lot of different things, whether they're partisan Democrats or partisan Republicans, and few people are hearing the honest to God's truth, as I see it at least.
Well, you said something kind of interesting there, Justin, and that's that we actually still have a way to go in the primary. So let's take that opportunity to kind of clarify where exactly we are, because I mentioned a few states, but there's 50 states, and let's make sure that we're doing a comprehensive job here. So the ones that I mentioned have already occurred are in Ohio, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. These are some of the big swing states or competitive states or battlegrounds that we've gotten used to over the last 20 years, although Ohio is moving a little bit away from that. And those ones have had their primaries. Although, just like you said, Justin, in Pennsylvania, we still have a little bit of counting to do before we know who the victor is going to be in that GOP U.S. Senate primary. But I think that you're suggesting, Justin, that there's actually a few other big states that we're still waiting for. So can you tell me what some of those might be?
Yeah, so we pretty much know who's going to be running in Florida. But for example, we don't know who's going to be the GOP contender in New Hampshire and very likely the favorite. We don't know who's going to be the GOP contender in Nevada, although Laxalt is the favorite and the NRA a week ago endorsed him. Not sure how much that will help him right now. But Sam Brown, Army veteran who's not pro-Trump, is apparently surging in the polls. And in primary polling, you can never be totally certain about what's going to happen. So at least in those two states, and I'm sure I can find some others, but those two are the big ones where we just don't know what's going to happen, and they could end up deciding control of the Senate.
I think that, in each race, we've got lots of different factors. No race is going to be decided by any one factor. But a couple of the ways of looking at this are the macro factors and the micro factors, right? So we have the macro factors, the conditions of the national economy, and also to a certain extent, the national election campaign and the national messaging. And then the micro factors are the things that matter to particular states and also that matter to particular candidates, the pros, the flaws of those particular candidates. And this is especially reflected, I think, in the Senate races, because the Senate races are some of the most personalized ones where the qualities or lack thereof for a particular candidate have the most impact on the result. That can be observed in a way that it can't if you're looking at the balance of the U.S. House, for example. So, Justin, we've seen in the past how there's been problems with poor candidates that have been nominated out of primaries. I remember in 2010 and 2012, there was a number of GOP nominees who lost winnable races, like Todd Akin in Missouri and Richard Murdoch in Indiana, and Sharon Angle, I believe that was in Nevada, and there was Christine O'Donnell in Delaware. And so these candidates lost winnable races. And I'm wondering, as we're heading into this election campaign, and we're seeing that the national factors might be in favor of the non-incumbent party if people aren't happy with the economy and so on, that the strength of those particular candidates is going to matter a lot. So, Justin, what do you think about some of the people that are coming out of these primaries? We have maybe Dr. Mezet Oz in Pennsylvania. We've got J.D. Vance certainly in Ohio, and we've got Herschel Walker in Georgia. So you think this is a good crop of recruits and nominees? What do you think?
So you just named off the celebrity crop, and those are all celebrities. So it'll be interesting. I do want to say one thing, though, that you said. So it's good to break this down. So you do have these fundamental factors like inflation, the price of gas, price of food. You have national security issues. So that would be guns at the moment. You have abortion, and you have the fact that Democrats are in power, and the party in power typically loses a lot of House seats and a few Senate seats every off-year election. Those fundamentals will be consistent across every single race. And we can get into that, but they will also largely dictate a lot of the messaging in these battleground states that are statewide elections, so the Senate. But to your point, what's going to separate these races are the quality of candidates run on the Democratic side, and then the quality of candidates on the Republican side. So looking at this election from the perspective of J.D. Vance, John, I don't think he's a good candidate at all. But honestly, I don't think it matters at all. Democrats are running a relatively strong Tim Ryan. My view on the whole situation is that Ohio is probably now Republican plus 6 to 10 points. I'd have to go back and check what Trump won by. I think it was like 8. And I don't think there's really anything short of a major October surprise, the term used for when there's a huge scandal that upends a race or a huge news story that changes the dynamics of a race. J.D. Vance is going to win. So we don't really need to, in my opinion, get into him as much just because of the fundamentals of Ohio, if that makes sense.
If a state is that heavily in one party or another, almost anyone can win, right?
Yes.
I'm thinking of Alabama, where Tommy Tuberville won a race. And, you might look at his credentials and think that he's unfit to be a U.S. senator, but the state is so strongly Republican that the limit was beyond him.
Short of a child pedophile.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say
anybody can win in these certain states.
Yeah. So there's a limit somewhere. There's a limit everywhere. There are certain people that cannot win, even in a state that's very heavily tilted in their direction on a partisan basis. And we found that limit when they nominated Roy Moore, a guy who was openly against the First Amendment and had been credibly accused of sex crimes against children. So there is a limit somewhere. But even people who are a bit eccentric or flamboyant can end up winning a race when the partisan balance is so heavily tilted in their direction. And, speaking of Tommy Tuberville, I thought you mentioned something that was really funny and interesting, Justin, which is that the 3 candidates that I named, the ones who won the biggest, highest profile primaries, and that is J.D. Vance, Herschel Walker, and perhaps Dr. Mezet Oz, are all celebrities. And I think you're right. And I think it's interesting that they're all celebrities. And I mean, Tommy Tuberville, I thought of it because we mentioned Tuberville, and he's also sort of a celebrity as well. But it is funny. So J.D. Vance, celebrity author and the focus of a Hollywood movie. Dr. Oz, of course, television personality. And Herschel Walker was a sports star, American football star in Georgia. And they're all celebrities and they're all running. And this maybe reflects that Trump effect, doesn't it, Justin? Because the Republicans, they had some success running a candidate who was primarily known for his work in the entertainment industry. And they were surprised that they were able to win a presidential election this way. In the past, Republicans won another presidential election with someone who was somewhat associated with the entertainment industry, Ronald Reagan, who was an actor before his decades-long political career. But maybe is the Donald Trump scenario and the popularity of Donald Trump encouraging Republicans to seek out celebrity candidates? Do you think that there's a Trump factor there?
I think that in any primary, especially in an off year, that the celebrity factor plays a major role because it's name recognition, right, John? You don't need to know who's on the ballot. You can just see that Dr. Oz or Herschel Walker from his glory days at UGA football. So I think it'll help. But again, I don't think it's going to be the defining factor in a lot of these races. So let's get into Georgia. They are a state, the governor's race, Senator Perdue, who was endorsed by Trump, lost by 50 points or somewhere near there to Brian Kemp, who was a little bit against Trump. Not really. He was endorsing Trump's views, putting doubt on the 2020 election, but he didn't overthrow the vote in 2020. So he took a lot of anger from Trump's supporters and Donald Trump himself. Now, Herschel Walker, on the other hand, is full pro-Trump. Trump is full pro Herschel Walker, and he was actually Mitch McConnell's last choice to run in Georgia because of a few reasons. So in his pro side of things, he is bigger than life in Georgia. He's a living legend. He was a football superstar in the 80s, and football is damn big in the state of Georgia. So he is a celebrity, like we mentioned. He has massive name recognition. He was generally seen as an upstanding guy as well, until you dig into his background. So he has massive allegations of violence with a firearm, of domestic abuse of his wife, and he's also said a lot of gross things publicly. So that's one strike against him. The other strike against him is he's not that equipped to debate the issues in public. He's going to struggle mightily against Senator Warnock on any debate stage, and when he's asked about the issue straight up, he doesn't really have great answers usually on a lot of them. Add in the fact that he is also relatively extreme in all of his views, and that abortion is becoming an issue nationwide, especially once the Supreme Court comes out with their case. And he said some pretty extreme things on abortion. He thinks that there should be no exceptions regarding abortion law, even in the instance of rape, incest, and the mother's life being at risk. So I'm sure he'll walk back the mother's life thing. But all of this adds up to you have a celebrity character endorsed by President Trump, endorsed now by Mitch McConnell, who has very little political policy acumen, who has a very, very, very checkered and I would say horrible past, violent past, and also who says extreme things that turns large amounts of the electorate off, and it gives some of the GOP a little bit pause for concern.
Yeah, and another factor, of course, is the candidate that they're running against. And Georgia is an interesting one to look at, Justin, because in the 2020 election cycle, there was this extremely rare thing, which was that the two U.S. Senate seats for the state were up for election at the same time. They were on the same schedule, and they were up at the same time. So we're able to see very directly which of the two Senate nominees were stronger than the other, because the same voters were going in and looking at both of their names on the ballot. So we had Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, who were the Democratic nominees, and people went in to vote in their races at the same time, and Warnock performed better than Ossoff. It was very slight. It was only a difference of about 20,000 votes, but Warnock performed better than Ossoff. So if you're going to go into this election hoping you have the best chance of victory, you're going to want the stronger of your two senators running. So you might think that Warnock is a little bit stronger than Ossoff, right? Maybe Warnock is a pretty good candidate. He's better than the other one. Has he got a chance of beating Herschel Walker in this state? Do you think that he could hold the seat?
Of course he does. And I think he is the stronger candidate, John. Again, not to get into policy issues, Warnock is actually relatively a moderate, and John Ossoff, who's actually from the Clinton campaign wing of things, is generally a little bit more progressive. But what Senator Warnock has going for him is 20 years of public speaking experience in the form of being a pastor and giving sermons, interacting with folks, his constituents from the pulpit or outside of the pulpit directly, gives him the ability to be a fantastic, obviously, orator, but also retail politician where he can shake hands, kiss babies, go have lunch with you, drink a beer, and do everything that you would see your prototypical politician doing. And he can do so in a way that is just very captivating. You're listening to him. It's energizing. It is something that all politicians really want to be able to do, but very few can, unfortunately. So I think that he is the stronger candidate. I think that he does have a good chance. And right now it's a toss-up, or maybe I would favor Herschel Walker in a matchup. But that's largely because we haven't seen Herschel Walker in any type of difficult campaign setting. It was a cakewalk for him. Once Trump endorsed him, once McConnell endorsed him, the Red Seas parted and there was no fierce pushback. The Democrats have held on to their opposition research, which we can get into as a campaign tactic, and things really just haven't turned up the heat yet. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out as the oppo and the ads and the media time come moving forward.
You know, I think it's kind of funny, that thing that you mentioned about Warnock's experience as a public presenter. And perhaps that brings us back a little bit to this idea of the celebrity candidates, because these people who have experience in the entertainment industry are people who have experience presenting publicly. And so that includes Reagan, it includes Arnold Schwarzenegger, it includes Donald Trump, but it also includes Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, right? And just like what you said about Warnock, and, you know, they have experience in front of the cameras and charming people. And perhaps that's the benefit. You know, another thing about Warnock that I remember was very successful in the last cycle was his ads. He had very compelling ads. He did an ad with a puppy where he was mocking the idea that he was some kind of extremist as the other campaign was trying to present him. He said, "Look at me, I'm a guy with a little dog. You know, I'm a lovable guy. I'm not a crazy guy. I'm like your neighbor." And it was with a lot of humor, and it was very effective. And it reminds me of the role that the national media and the national advertising architecture behind these campaigns can play. And I think that maybe this brings us to the reason why Justin Higgins himself is a person to talk to about this. And that's because, Justin, you yourself worked on the media side and communication side of the national GOP campaign. So, I mean, I think anyone who's listened to this program is aware of this, but, you know, can you quickly kind of tell us about the experience that you did have in that side of campaigning and why it gives you an informed perspective as we assess the campaigns today?
Well, like anybody, I've worked on your statewide or your congressional district campaign as well. But I think what is unique is at the RNC, you know, mid-level employee, senior opposition researcher, I was focused on influencing the national media narrative on healthcare back in 2016, national defense, foreign affairs, and veterans affairs. So my job was to not only create talking points for all the surrogates that you see on Fox News, MSNBC, CNN for the Republicans at the time, but it was also to create bullet points and narratives to either advance media topics that were being discussed in a way that we found positive, or to completely push back to the point where we are refuting what is on CNN, or we are trying to obfuscate viewers with what is on CNN. So in that aspect of things, I think I have a relatively unique understanding of how the national media environment is not only shaped, but also influenced. And the national media environment, while not as necessarily important to the day-to-day issues of a statewide campaign, it's still very important because it relates to the fundamentals that we originally talked to, which is the economy, inflation, wages, jobs, abortion, gun control, and also how those issues are perceived by the base of each party. What messages resonate from the national media down to the state base level grassroots advocates and ultimately turn out those voters. So that's the lens that I'm coming from.
I mean, this is all very relevant for assessing the way that these campaigns are operating today. And at the kind of micro level, like we were talking about on the candidate and race level, but also on the national level. And I think that that's probably where, Justin, you're probably best suited to comment today, because you haven't necessarily worked in all of the states that these candidates are running. You might not be familiar with the particulars of a strategy, in the state of Georgia and so on.
I feel comfortable enough to comment on these things as well, if not better than CNN's Alyssa Farah or Rick Santorum and Dave Urban or anybody else who hasn't worked, hand in hand on these state level campaigns.
Yes, I was just about to say, Justin, that certainly the lack of direct and relevant experience information has never stopped many people in the media from making commentary.
Sure hasn't stopped Gloria Borgia, bless her heart.
Okay, well, we try to do a better job here, Justin. We try to ask people about things that they're informed about. You're generally a pretty good way to go. So that's why I want to ask you now about the national media strategies. Because, look, here's something that Justin knows about. And, maybe sometime you can ask me about how to write TV guide synopses for Arabic language TV shows.
Sounds riveting.
Yeah, riveting stuff, and very relevant for a discussion of American political news. So let's ask you then about the thing that you know best. So let's talk about this national media strategy, the national political communications from the Republican Party. So you experienced it leading up to the 2016 presidential election. That was the era of what was called the Growth and Opportunity Report, the Reince Priebus era assessment of what the GOP should do strategically, which was called the post-2012 election autopsy.
Well, it was the death of that report.
Yes, indeed. But, we're living in the post-Growth and Opportunity Report era until we get to 2016, and then we have the post-Trump election era. So I want to ask you about how these eras are different, like how the way that you approached communications and strategy at this time. Tell me now, what are they saying today? What do you think are the top line messages that we're getting out of the RNC's communications and strategy instruments? What is their strategy, briefly put?
Yes. So I think that largely because races in these states have become so nationalized, there are a lot of similarities. I think that the difference in what we're seeing from the RNC is, first, they're not going to be as involved without the presidential election, without needing to basically do all of the infrastructure and support for the Trump campaign, which was relatively unprecedented back in 2016. So that's one thing. The other thing is they nowadays, when I was there actually back in 2016, our job was to make our point through using MSNBC, CNN, CBS, ABC, mainstream media, not Republican mainstream media, but what Republicans would term as mainstream media. So we wanted narratives that resonated with our point of view, with our candidate, with our goals that were coming from the quote unquote left. Nowadays, I don't know if it's because they're not putting as much time in, because things have become much more extreme. If you just look at them on Twitter, you look at the materials that they're putting out, they are using Fox News, they are using OAN and Newsmax, and they are using a feedback loop. So they will go to Fox News, they will give Fox News talking points, Fox News will run those talking points as is, and then what will happen is the RNC will say, hey, look at these talking points. Isn't this great? This makes our point. We weren't allowed to do that because we were a much more credible organization before Trump in 2016. So that's the major difference, John, is tactically speaking. But I would like to, at some point, get into the messaging. I remember
something that's relevant to this that you've introduced, Justin. And I remember when Steve Bannon was trying to get the message out about conflicts of interest at the Clinton charities. There was a book that was called Clinton Cash that was exploring all of this. And they were thinking about where to give the advanced copy of the book. And I think some people said, well, we can give it to Fox News and, they'll do big stories about it and they'll push out our message. But Steve Bannon said to them that the most important thing was to make sure that the credible mainstream media were talking about this. So they needed to give the book to the New York Times. They needed to try to get these stories in the New York Times. And just like you're saying, and this was Bannon, who is sometimes associated with extremist media, like the podcast project that he was doing around the time of the insurrection. Even he understood the value of getting the mouthpieces of mainstream credible media to say what you want them to say.
So exactly. So here it is, right? Let's say you have a claim that President Trump made during the campaign, and you can apply this now to 2022, that the election was stolen, for example, in 2020, or whatever you want. And you had a claim where President Trump said Obama founded ISIS. So our goal, we were never going to be able to get the mainstream media to say, oh, of course Obama founded ISIS. Trump is right. That wasn't our goal.
Well, you know who did repeat that? Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. He used that as evidence. He said, look, an American presidential candidate is admitting that the U.S. created ISIS, just like we've been saying, we, the extreme Shia community in Lebanon. So, yeah, they did get people to repeat it, but go on.
So my job was to find research that would ultimately be credible to obfuscate that narrative on national news, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times. So what I did was I dug up a report from the Hoover Institute at Stanford, showed that under President Bush, there was a direct and precipitous decline of AQIP, which was the precursor organization of ISIS, that when President Obama, they were nearly non-existent. When President Bush left office, President Obama came in, changed some policies, and the organization began to flourish. Now, of course, that is just the top line report. There is much more to do with that. President Obama did not found ISIS. And anyways, so my job was to take that report language out of context and then build a story around it where we would cite the New York Times or CNN or Jake Tapper saying that President Bush had gotten rid of a lot of these extremists, and then to use similar reports from the same people showing that under President Obama, ISIS was exploding, because back then it was. Our goal was then to feed these narratives, these reports, right back to CNN. Again, we weren't trying to say Trump is right, Obama's wrong, Clinton's wrong. What we were trying to do was to get them on their show to explain in greater context that under President Bush, there was a precipitous decline and the organization was in decay, but under President Obama, it rose. Once we got that comparison made, we considered our job over, because a lot of those viewers were just going to absorb that, hey, under President Bush, they were declining. Then under President Obama, they came to fruition and they really became a force. They weren't going to listen to the nuance. They were just going to hear something that would reinforce their already preconceived notions. So once it was being debated on CNN and even fact-checked on CNN, we considered our job one, because our hardcore supporters would be like, hey, even CNN is saying this. And then people in the middle who didn't have policy expertise, maybe they just heard the facts under Bush and the facts under Obama, and they'd say, hey, maybe Trump isn't full of shit. And just that seed of doubt was enough for us to consider it a win. So when it comes to national media, it's not always just pushing your narrative. It's being able to obfuscate and sow doubt with voters so that ultimately whatever your candidate says, no matter how crazy it is, the listeners and the audience members are more receptive to trusting them.
You know, that reminds me of a famous political quote, what you've just said. And I think it's by Lyndon B. Johnson. I'm pretty sure it is. I don't want to say for sure, but he helped put out some attack that was totally unfair and untrue. And he said, why am I doing this? Because I just want to see the son of a bitch deny it. Just like you've said, there's a benefit to having the issue discussed. Imagine the photograph of a person on the headline and saying, Hillary Clinton says, I did not create ISIS. There, you've got a picture of her and creating ISIS in the headline. And it's disgraceful and completely dishonest.
It goes even further than that, because let's say 70% of the viewers on CNN agree with them and 30% don't. We just wanted CNN discussing the issue because their anchors aren't subject matter experts. Their producers aren't subject matter experts. So they're going to be clumsy in explaining it. The people listening aren't experts. And we were sure as hell likely, if we did our job right, and CNN is CNN and they're the best at what they do, in my opinion, that we would get those 30% to come away and saying, hey, maybe Obama did create ISIS.
So what you're describing then is a system and culture of systemic and acknowledged and known and active dishonesty.
I remember my job was Obamacare and we were messaging against it. And what I learned was it helped 30 million people get healthcare. It really fucked over, pardon my language, 1 million people. It raised their premiums. It taxed them a lot. It was really unfair to 1 million Americans, but 30 million Americans benefited. So I turned next to my guy who was sitting to my right at that time. He was more senior. And I'm like, hey, so-and-so, if we win and if we repeal Obamacare, what are we going to replace it with? And he looks me dead in the eyes and he goes, Justin, our job isn't to worry about what happens if we win. Our job is just to win. And that sets the scene for what a campaign is. You are ruthless. It is a zero-sum game. Short of cheating, and some people don't follow that rule, almost anything goes. Lying, it's all good.
So, okay, then, let me ask you this. And we're still kind of here talking about the organization of campaigns rather than talking about the specific races. But let me ask you this. You're describing a complete disconnect from the policy ambitions and the policy positions and goals of a candidate and the message that he is putting out to the electorate. There are people on campaigns and certainly in the political offices whose job it is to look after policy matters and to attend to them and to write legislation and to figure out the goals and ambitions of the public figure. Is there a communication between the people working on a campaign who are trying to develop the policy plan for the candidate and those that are involved in the messaging? Because you've described such an incredibly massive disconnect where the legislative plan is not in any way connected to what the campaign is telling the voters that they're intending to do.
Yes, and the Trump campaign was rather unique in that it was all 100% branding, right? But what I would argue is in the policy shop, it's very similar to what I was doing, which was the research department. And in the Clinton campaign, for example, I think you had Jake Sullivan, who was a policy person. But any major decision, the head of comms, Robbie Mook, Jake Sullivan, and a couple others were going to be involved in, especially with the media, campaigning, anything. So what I would argue, John, is that the policy part of a presidential campaign is a nice way for the kids of big donors to get in a campaign and say they had a policy position when they're really just doing research that ends up being used as communications. No real policy work gets done on a campaign. Maybe it starts in the transition, but I would just take a contention with saying that that's a funny, nice title that if you're a billionaire, you're the daughter of a billionaire, you get to work on foreign affairs for Hillary Clinton, for example.
Well, in a congressional race, let's say a Senate race, if you're an incumbent, you've got your office back in DC that work on policy, and they're not supposed to be directly affiliated with the campaign, right? But if you're a challenger, a non-incumbent, you're building up the staff that is going to become the staff of your office if you win, right? So some of the policy roles in the office are going to be filled by people working in the campaign, right? Or is that not the case?
Sure. Some of them, it's usually the chief of staff, the legislative director, the communications director. Those are the ones that tend to go right over. But yes, but they don't need to know policy. Some of the policy staff go over there, and then you just learn in your first 3 to 6 months. Every office is filled out differently.
So I think that this explanation that you're giving us then is a relevant one as we're looking at this fall's elections, because you're talking about how the complaint isn't necessarily connected with the policy ambition of the candidate. They say, here's something bad that we don't like, and they can talk about that, but they won't really tell you what they're going to do about it. And that's something that I think that we can observe with these upcoming elections, right? Because they are complaining about real things that we all agree are problems. You know, the campaigns are saying, the Republican campaigns are saying, inflation is a big problem, it's hurting us, and the stock market is doing very badly, right? And we all agree with this. I mean, I'm very disappointed with the stock market. I'm very unhappy about inflation. But they haven't really told us what they're going to do about these things, have they? And I mean, that reflects the disconnect that you're talking about with the health policy, right? I mean, Justin, have you heard any of the candidates for this fall's elections on either side, Republicans or Democrats, say what they intend to do about problems in the stock market and inflation?
Yes. So the Democrats tend to run more on policy. But to your point, John, so for example, if the Democrats hold the House, they win a few more seats in the Senate, their policy solutions are abolish the filibuster, pass a nationwide piece of legislation.
Hold on. To be clear, abolishing the filibuster is not a policy. Procedural to get to a policy outcome.
Correct. Their policy outcomes are to change the procedure by abolishing the filibuster, and then pass comprehensive abortion protection, comprehensive gun laws, immigration, voting rights. But every single policy issue has to be based in political reality. And for the most part, they're mostly running on winning enough seats to get rid of the filibuster, and they're eschewing bipartisanship. On the other hand, Republicans don't have to, and most of the time, midterm elections are not ran on policy. They're ran on opposition to the current status of the country and also the current party in power. So, like, for example, you saw Rick Scott, who's the head of the Republican senatorial campaign, release this massive policy platform. And in 1994, for example, in the opposition, Newt Gingrich released the Contract with America, which was a lot of procedural stuff, but then there were 8 specific pieces of policy, like lowering taxes, small business, term limits, so on and so forth. But when Rick Scott, and this just shows you how much the campaign environment has evolved recently, Rick Scott released this policy platform, Mitch McConnell got pissed. Because Mitch McConnell said you don't release policy that allows people to run against you in specific ways, because our goal is not to run on policy. Our goal is to say, look at how awful things are. It's the fault of the Democrats who control the House, control the Senate, control the presidency. And in turn, not only will that juice our turnout of our base, not only will that likely depress the turnout of the Democratic base because they will become apathetic, because they will agree all of these things are awful. Their political party is in power. So what's the point of going and voting if things are going to be awful when their political party is in power? But also it will win over independents, because independents will see the Republicans' message. They'll say, hey, you know what? They are true. Biden, inflation has been terrible. Biden, Afghanistan withdrawal was awful. It was a disgrace. Biden, XYZ, there's gun killings, so much, so on and so forth. Maybe the Republicans deserve a try. So in this election, whether it be Georgia, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, the ultimate goal will be to run against the current administration, providing as few specific policy proposals as possible, but using as divisive and polarizing language as they can come up with to just energize their base.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny to me that you said that the midterm elections are not about policy, because it seems a little bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? The presidential elections have much more well-known figures running. There's much more media attention, and there's a much larger voter base. So it seems to me that you've got generally a lower information voter is much more likely to participate in that than in a midterm. That the midterm elections, it's smaller, it's not in the news as much, the candidates aren't as well known. You are generally going to get people who follow the news much more closely. Like, to the extent that there's a difference in those electorates, and both are big, but one is a lot smaller than the other. The smaller one is the one that's got higher information, more politically active people running. But these are people who are not motivated by policy, you think? I mean, again, we're making huge generalizations here, but in comparison to a presidential election electorate, you think they care about policy less, the higher information voters?
Well, nowadays, I don't think really many people care that much about policy. I think the policy matters in the way that it's reflected in the national sentiment and the way that the media covers it and the way that the opposition research can come out of it. So, for example, Medicare for All was a boneheaded decision by the Democrats who ran in the 2020 primary. You saw Kamala Harris, who was an original co-sponsor on the bill in the Senate, when she declared her presidency, within a few days, she flip-flopped because she realized, oh shit, this is too extreme. What this is going to allow is for all of the moderate candidates like President Biden and the others, and Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, to paint her as a far left progressive to their electorate, and she as a somewhat standard establishment liberal would never be able to resonate with the progressives who would like that type of policy. So she immediately flip-flopped. So I don't know if policy matters so much as it is used to establish a national narrative around a candidate, around a campaign, and around a party. But especially in the midterms, like you're saying, John, it is a smaller group of hardcore voters where those type of policy narratives won't really resonate as well. So there's less benefit for the risk that you are incurring by throwing something out there. But more specifically, in this type of environment, it will be more beneficial for the Democrats to lay out policies because, quite frankly, the fundamentals are awful, which we've explained. So they would want to run on something that is positive, something that is hopeful, if not something that will solve a problem that, pointing to that problem, can energize their base. So, for example, abortion and Roe being overturned by the Supreme Court, it would benefit the Democrats to highlight that as much as possible and then provide a policy solution, because they're going to be able to energize their base with the current problem, which is Roe being overturned. And then they're going to say, hey, these guys support that, but if you come look at us, we actually have a solution.
I put that to you not necessarily because I disagree, but just because I wanted to challenge you and kind of hear your thoughts about it. The question of whether highly active voters care more or less about policy than the voters who are less active and might turn out only in a presidential. I think that I've noticed a phenomenon. I don't know if this is really new, but there's certainly the rise of the political hobbyist. And these are some of the most engaged voters, some of the most active news followers. And they are often quite disconnected from policy because they follow narratives a lot of the time. You know, if you're spending all of your time on Twitter and you're the most highly active, engaged voter, it's very possible that you're actually thinking a little bit less about these kitchen table issues than you are about all of the narratives and storylines and personalities. So it is possible to me, I think it's plausible, that a lot of these very highly engaged voters that come out in midterms are not voters who are thinking as much about policy. And the voters who are less engaged might be the ones who are thinking, all right, how's the economy doing? And as they go out to vote. For example, if you interact with the most highly engaged Trump supporters, Trump voters, they almost never talk about policy at all. I mean, the reasons that they are interested in voting have to do with narratives, cultural attitudes, the team that they're on. They'll talk about some conspiracy theory about the election or the investigation into the Trump campaign's context with Russian agents. They'll talk about that instead of talking about, well, the reason I support Donald Trump is because I love the corporation tax cut. You know what I mean? So sometimes the more engaged you are, the more disconnected you actually become from the policy. That's a phenomenon, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And a lot of these activists actually go and they meet with either the candidates in their Senate offices or the challengers in their campaign offices, and they will talk about the policies that matter to them. So let's bring this to specific examples. Herschel Walker, I am sure, has spoken to the pro-life movement, and that is probably one of the reasons why he publicly said there should be no exceptions for abortion. That is probably a message that he wanted to hear from one of his most ardent groups of support. So that is to say that these activists, extremists on the right, extremists on the left, they just want to be comfortable that your candidate is on the same ideological spectrum as them and that you will fight for those issues. It's less what the tax code is for corporate taxes. Is it 20% or 19.5%? It's more, are you with me on the culture wars? And that is what energizes these grassroots activists. Like you were saying, John, are you with me that Trump didn't collude with Russia, that the election was stolen in 2020? And then for the Democrats, are you with me that we are for healthcare for all and that we are for preventing or trying to mitigate the effects of climate change? It's these big, big ideas as opposed to the specific policies about those ideas.
Yeah, and I mean,
and it's virtue signaling, not to interrupt you. It's virtue signaling. So if a candidate in a tough primary or in a general election stakes out an extreme position, it's likely for them to say, hey, folks, to the most extreme of you, I am with you. Just turn out, get all your friends to turn out, and we'll be okay because we're fighting for the exact same thing.
It really does need to be said almost any time that a conversation about this topic is undertaken that this fan approach to politics is incredibly unhealthy. And I say that acknowledging, as an active news follower, that I am sometimes guilty of this myself. I think it's a difficult instinct to avoid when you're following the news closely, to pick a team and have favorite characters and personalities as you follow the news. It's really not good. There isn't any reason why people should be more sentimental about a personality in the news that they don't know than they should about their own neighbor, right? The fandom and the I'm rooting for my team that's developed in these relationships that people have with candidates, the most active voters, is not the appropriate way of looking at the business of government. We shouldn't be fans of any of these people. They're public servants, and their job is to create policy to benefit us and the public. And we don't want to be disconnected from policy as we approach campaigns. We want to try to focus on how the campaigns will lead to elections that will lead to policymakers, that will lead to laws that affect all of us. And so that is why it's important to say, just like you've said, Justin, and perhaps exposed to any of these listeners, that often there is a huge disconnect between what the candidates intend to do in office and what they're telling you as they run.
There's a large disconnect. And I think what is important, and maybe we should get into a little bit more of the specifics, but ultimately, when looking at this midterm and why do people say there's going to be this big red wave, it's not so much to do with the candidates themselves. And you could argue that some of these candidates are great on the GOP side, for example, or that they're not so great. But it really has to do with just the fundamentals. The fact that the way that consultants view voters, and I'm not saying I endorse this, the way that consultants view voters is outside of those hardcore extremists that are going to turn out no matter what, John. They view the voters that are liberal and conservative, that are partisan, but may or may not turn out as this. If their party is not in power, so if you're a Republican and you have Democratic unified control, they view it as much more likely that these sometime voters are going to turn out because they're going to project their situation and whether or not they are happy with their lives or not onto the national narrative of the economy, of the defense, of everything that's going on in politics. And then they're also going to take that and say, hey, a Democrat's in office. I'm not really happy with my financial standing. The way to change this is go out and vote a Republican in. On the converse, you have the same thing happening with Democratic voters. It's the Democratic voters who may not turn out. A lot of consultants, even the Democratic consultants, think, well, if their party's in control and things aren't that great, and they're going to project this onto the national political figures, their heroes, so to speak, or people that they support and they vote on, maybe they won't turn out because they'll be apathetic because they think, my situation in life, not really great right now. I'm paying too much for gas, for food. My party is in power, so it really doesn't matter if I'm going to go out and vote because it won't really change anything and help me in the immediate term. So that's why you hear about this massive enthusiasm gap. It's basically a lot of consultants thinking that the sometimes voters are going to project their situation onto the current form of government, and depending on what they see, that will influence whether or not they vote.
Well, Justin, I think that what you've just described actually demonstrates something else, and that's that overpromising on policy is very dangerous. So you were talking about how before the Republicans took control of the government, they were saying they were going to overturn the Health Care Act, and they had no interest in actually doing it. This was a very bad politics for them because they lost everything soon after. The voters were expecting something and they didn't get it. And, the Democrats will tell you that healthcare was their best issue going into those 2018 elections that took control of the House of Representatives away from the Republicans. So overpromising puts you in this dangerous situation. And I think that is part of where the Democrats have gotten into a bit of trouble. You were talking about how during the presidential election, there was this whole discussion about whether we're going to have a single-payer healthcare plan or whether there's going to be a public option, a market-based healthcare plan with a new public health insurance provider that people could buy into. None of these things have happened. And so people who listen to this discussion, understanding it to be the basis for policy making that would come after the elections, they've got to be quite disappointed, haven't they? So I think that overpromising is dangerous, and that's part of why this disconnect that you've mentioned between the policy apparatus and the campaign apparatus is putting these campaigns in a pretty bad situation, anything beyond the near term.
I agree, and I think you hit the nail on the head. So there is a trope from consultants who just want to bloodsuck money out of Democrats that say Democrats are awful at messaging, and it's this blanket statement.
Yeah, this is like the Lincoln Project, for example.
The Lincoln Project, for example. Steve Schmidt, who's absolutely touched and also
Rick
very
Wilson.
Sweaty.
Rick
Wilson.
Says that, yeah.
They've fundraised. They actually steal money from candidates because the funds go to them instead of the race. Anyways,
They say the party that won a trifecta doesn't know how to win.
Yeah, the party that won. So I will say this. The Biden White House notwithstanding, they're not good at messaging. Congressional Democrats are great at it. You look at Jim Clyburn, you're telling me he doesn't know how to win a race or energize a base. You're telling me that Nancy Pelosi, who may not be the best speaker, but she has experience, Hakeem Jeffries, even I don't agree with them on nearly anything, but the progressives, they know how to fire up their base. And these folks are messaging to each of their different perspectives. So putting that aside, I think you just hit on one of the largest issues facing the Democrats. They didn't have to promise all of these big, shiny, gold-plated, diamond, platinum things once they got into office. Joe Biden didn't have to do that. He shouldn't have done that. His whole campaign was running on just being better than the other guy, just being stable. You don't have to wake up at 5 a.m. and worry about what the president had tweeted to see if we're at nuclear war with Iran. You just had to vote Biden in, forget about government. Everything's going to be just back to normal. That's what he ran on. That's why he won. Instead of taking that approach and saying, hey, we're going to pass the largest relief bill in history. Hey, we're going to pass bipartisan infrastructure. This is going to be two of the largest accomplishments for the first year of a presidency in modern history. Hey, we're going to help Ukraine save their democracy. We're going to end the war in Afghanistan and have people be happy. They overpromised. And not only did they not deliver, so not only are they upsetting their progressives and taking away energy from the base, which is the voters that are just assumed to turn out, but they're also opening themselves up, and this will be happening, to attacks from the right, which we will see, where the candidates say that Biden is socialist, that the candidate they're running against in the Senate is socialist. It won't resonate on Biden, so to speak, but it will resonate on these other candidates. So I think that is a very big problem. And this has been borne out. There was an Axios article that the language used in 2022 is much more extreme than the language in, I believe it was 2016. And it's these GOP candidates already are trying to paint their opponents as socialist, as dangerous, as extreme. So it's a lot of bellicose language being used. And the Biden administration, with their really ridiculous approach to legislating, have opened them up for those attacks to resonate.
What you just said reminds me of something else really interesting that is a different problem with overpromising. And that's, not that the Biden campaign overpromised about policy in this regard, but it's that the Biden campaign promised that the news would stop. They said, you can stop waking up in the morning afraid in the news, because you can stop thinking about the news all the time. There's too much news. And this was something another candidate in that election was proposing. That Michael Bennet, U.S. Senator from Colorado, who's running, he said, my theory about why you should elect me is that you should not need to know or care about who the president is. If I'm president, you'll forget my name. I'm going to be like a Dutch politician. And you'll never have to know who I am or think about me. The news will be interesting to hobbyists, but ordinary people can get along with their lives. And this is a dangerous thing to overpromise, because the news is never going to stop. No matter who's in the White House, significant events are going to happen in the world. And I think that because the Trump presidency was such an anomaly in so many ways, people had the wrong idea about what current events are and the inevitability of events. So Donald Trump, it was extraordinary news all the time. The news felt like it was moving faster than ever. But when he's gone, it doesn't mean that nothing's going to happen again. I mean, in the first year of Biden's presidency, we've had all these new pandemic variants. We had the Afghanistan withdrawal and the seizure of the country by the Taliban. And we've now had the largest war in Europe in decades. And all of these things happened with a president who has tried to be much less colorful than the incumbent, and also less colorful than he's ever been in his political career up to this point. Deliberate boringness on behalf of a person who's never really been thought of as boring. But no matter how boring he tries to be, he can't make the news stop. And so people need to stop expecting that will ever be possible.
That concludes today's conversation. Please take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our other upcoming episodes. And if you would like to join us live, hear past episodes, or ask one of our upcoming guests a question, please visit our website, pm101.live. Today's episode is the first part of a series examining political messaging in the 2022 elections, how politicians share ideas, how voters take up those ideas, and what it all adds up to in terms of electoral results. This has been Politics and Media 101. No matter where you are in the world, thank you for being a part of this community. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, our co-founders. We hope to hear from you soon.